Hello there, welcome to HFY Quantum Pro. Here, helping one another makes the universe smarter. So, what we are waiting for? Let's begin our story.
The notebook had a coffee stain on the cover, a broken spiral on the left edge, and exactly 43 blank pages left. Nora Solis knew this because she had counted them during last week's lecture on the evolution of written trade symbols. She had also counted the ceiling tiles. There were 216. Professor Aldrich was talking again. He was always talking. His voice had a quality that made even interesting things sound like the legal terms at the end of a medication advertisement. Today's topic was symbolic compression in pre-modern script systems. Nora had read the chapter. She understood it. She did not need to listen to it being read back to her word for the third time this semester. She drew. She always drew when her hands were bored. Not pictures of anything in particular. Not flowers or faces or the kind of cartoons her classmates doodled. She drew the shapes from her grandfather's notebooks. Curves that folded back on themselves. Angles that broke at precise degrees. Lines that connected in patterns that felt, somehow, like they had a logic to them, even if she had never understood what that logic was. Her grandfather had filled 11 notebooks with these shapes. He had spent 30 years chasing them across 3 continents. He called them the most beautiful thing he had ever found, and he never once learned what they meant. He gave the notebooks to Nora when she was 7, the last birthday he was present for, and told her to keep them safe because the world did not always recognize the value of a thing it could not read. She had kept them. She had read them so many times that the shapes lived in her hands now. She could draw them without looking. Her pen moved on its own while her eyes drifted to the window, to the gray November sky, to a pigeon sitting on the ledge outside, looking equally uninterested in symbolic compression. The sequence she was drawing today was a long one. She had started it in the top left corner of the page and let it spiral slowly inward, each section connecting to the next the way her grandfather had always arranged them. He had a specific order. She had never questioned why. It was just how the shapes went. She drew the final stroke. It was a small motion. A short diagonal line that closed the innermost section of the spiral. The kind of mark that takes less than a second. The lights went out. Not a flicker. Not a slow fade. They cut off completely, and the lecture hall dropped into the flat gray light coming through the windows, and everyone looked up at once with the specific expression humans make when something happens that they do not have an explanation for yet. Then every door in the building locked. The sound was loud and mechanical, a series of heavy thuds in rapid sequence like something industrial cycling shut. The student nearest the side door grabbed the handle out of reflex, and it did not move. Someone in the back row said a word that Professor Aldrich would normally have commented on. He did not comment on it. Every phone in the room died at the same moment. Not powered off, just blank. Dark screens that would not respond to buttons. Then the tone came. Was not loud. It was not a siren or an alarm. It was a single, deep sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the kind of frequency that you feel in your back teeth before you properly hear it with your ears. It lasted 4 seconds, and then it stopped. Then a voice spoke. It was calm and clear and came from the same source list everywhere as the tone had. It spoke first in a language none of them recognized, then in Mandarin, then in Spanish, then in English. Kiru activation signal detected. This is an automated response from Galactic Observation Protocol 7. All civilian personnel, please remain in your current positions. Movement outside the building is not advised at this time. High Command has been notified. A liaison will arrive shortly. Thank you for your patience. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room full of people all decide at the same moment that they have no idea what the correct response is. Professor Aldrich stood at the front with his lecture notes still in his hand. His mouth was open. He closed it. Then he opened it again. Then he looked at his students the way a person looks when they have spent 40 years in academia preparing for many things, and this was not among them. Does anyone, he said carefully, know what a kiru is? Nobody answered. Nora looked down at her notebook. The shape on the page looked the same as it always did. Curves and angles and lines. The spiral she had drawn 100 times before, in the margins of homework and on the backs of receipts and on the fogged-up window of a bus when she was 12, she had just finished it for the first time. She understood, in a slow and certain way, that the difference between all the other times and this time was that final stroke. The short diagonal line, the one that closed the innermost section. Her grandfather had never drawn that line. She had always thought the spiral looked unfinished. She had always assumed he simply ran out of time, or space, or energy. The last notebook ended mid-page, and she had never questioned it that a shadow passed over the building. Something large, moving slowly, descending through the cloud cover with the unhurried confidence of something that did not need to hide. Nora did not run to the window like the others did. She sat very still and looked at the completed spiral and thought about her grandfather and the 30 years he had given to shapes he never understood. And she thought that wherever he was probably either very proud or very sorry, and she genuinely could not decide which. Outside, something landed. The pigeons left the ledge. The building did not shake. Whatever had landed was very, very good at landing. The door opened from the outside. This was notable because the door had been locked from the outside. The students nearest to it stepped back without being asked. When a door that was sealed 30 minutes ago opens on its own, the body makes certain decisions before the brain catches up. The being that stepped through was tall. Not impossibly tall, not the kind of tall that required ducking through the frame, but tall enough that every person in the room recalibrated their sense of scale slightly. It had gray skin with a faint texture like old paper. It had 4 eyes arranged in a slight arc across its face, all of them the same pale color, and they moved independently in a way that suggested it was looking at several things at once without making it seem rude. IT was wearing what looked like a uniform. Dark, fitted, no visible insignia that any of them could read. 2 more beings stood behind it in the corridor, still and silent. The tall one stepped fully into the room and spoke in English. "I apologize for the disruption to your session," it said. Its voice was even and unhurried. "There is no danger. The lockdown is a precautionary protocol, not an emergency response. You will be free to leave within the hour. I need approximately 5 minutes of one student's time." Its 4 eyes, moving on their own small independent tracks, all converged on the same point, that on Nora. She did not look away. She was not sure why. The reasonable response was probably to look away. "Did I do this?" she said. It was not quite a question. She already knew. Something shifted in the tall being's expression. It was subtle. The face was not built the same way a human face was built, and reading it took a moment, but what Nora eventually identified in it was something close to the look a person makes when they have prepared a long and careful explanation and the other person has skipped directly to the conclusion. Behind the tall being, one of the 2 silent ones in the corridor made a small sound. A quiet, involuntary sound. Professor Aldrich would later describe it to colleagues as the alien equivalent of dropping your coffee mug, which he thought was quite good for someone who had never encountered an alien before 40 minutes ago. "Yes," the tall being said. "You did." It introduced itself as Liaison Greth. It said the title before the name in the way of someone used a context where the title mattered more. It explained, briefly and in plain language, that what Nora had drawn was an activation sequence for a piece of very old technology buried a significant distance beneath the university. The technology had been dormant for approximately 40,000 years. It was now active and broadcasting that a student in the 3rd row raised her hand and asked if they were all going to die. Greth said no. The student asked if they were sure. Greth said yes. Professor Aldrich, who had recovered somewhat, asked what branch of government Liaison Greth represented. Greth said it did not represent any Earth government. Aldrich asked what government it did represent. Greth said that was a longer conversation and suggested they have it somewhere with better seating. Greth then returned its attention to Nora and asked where she had learned the sequence. Nora told it about her grandfather. The notebooks, the stone carvings on an island she had never visited. 30 years of field work reduced to 11 notebooks that he gave to a 7-year-old because he trusted her more than he trusted institutions. The being called Greth was quiet for a moment, and then asked if Nora would come with it. It said the word "come" with an emphasis that made clear it was offering a choice and not giving an order. The distinction seemed important to it. Nora looked at Professor Aldrich. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had no idea what the correct advice was and was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. Nora picked up her notebook, put the pen in her pocket, and stood. The other students watched her walk to the door. Nobody said anything. The moment had a quality to it that made speaking feel wrong, the way speaking feels wrong in certain buildings or at certain hours of the night. She stepped into the corridor. The two silent ones moved aside without being asked. The building's front doors were open. The November air came through, gray and cold and smelling of wet pavement, which was normal. What was not normal was what was in the car park, that IT was not enormous. That was the first thing she noticed. She had expected enormous. Everything about the last 30 minutes suggested enormous. But the ship, if that was the right word, was roughly the size of a medium warehouse, and it had settled between the rows of parked cars with a precision that was almost considerate. Almost. 2 rows of bicycles along the far fence had not survived the landing radius. Greth, walking beside her, noticed her looking at the bicycles. "We will replace those," it said. "There are about 40 of them," Nora said. "We will replace all 40, Greth said. Without missing a step, they walked toward the ship. A section of its side had opened into a ramp, clean and even, lit from below with a light that had no color she could name. Greth walked up it without slowing. Nora followed. She did not look back at the building. She thought that if she looked back, she might stop walking, and she did not want to stop walking. Her grandfather had spent 30 years looking for where these shapes came from. She was going to find out in an afternoon. The room they put her in was white and clean and slightly too tall, as if whoever designed it had known humans existed, but had not quite gotten the proportions personal enough to feel right. The chair was comfortable. The table was smooth and empty. The ceiling was a full head taller than it needed to be. There was a cup of something on the table when she sat down. It was warm and pale brown and smelled faintly of something that was not tea, but was clearly trying to be tea. Nora picked it up and held it. She did not drink it. The one called Aid Soren stood near the wall. It was younger than Greth in the way you could tell without being told, the same way you could tell with people. It was watching her with the intensity of something that had read a lot about a subject and was now seeing in person for the first time. It said, "I made the drink. I read that humans find warm liquid calming." Nora said, "That's true." It said, "I may have gotten the temperature slightly wrong." Nora drank some of it. The temperature was slightly wrong. She did not mention this. Commander Duras arrived with the air of someone who managed difficult situations for a living and found this one personally inconvenient. It was broader than Greth, darker in color, and moved with the energy of a being who considered sitting down a mild compromise. It placed a flat device on the table, touched a point on its surface, and a soft light rose from it in a thin column. Then it explained the KRU-IT took 12 minutes. Nora listened without interrupting. The Kiru were a species who had existed in this region of the galaxy for something approaching 1,000,000 years. They were not the oldest species on record, but they were among the most studied because what they left behind was unlike anything any other extinction had produced. They did not leave ruins. They left systems, buried, dormant, waiting. Infrastructure spread across hundreds of planets, installed so deep and so carefully that removal was essentially impossible without triggering the very activation events the galactic community had spent 2 centuries trying to prevent. Their written language was not decorative. It was functional. Specific sequences of their script interacted with the deep quantum layer that all their technology operated on. Most of the sequences were maintenance commands, cataloging, status checks. The activation sequences, the ones that could wake dormant systems from full standby, were fewer in number but considerably more significant in effect. The sequence Nora had drawn was one of those. Duras explained all of this in the tone of someone delivering a briefing they had hoped never to have to deliver. It was thorough. It was accurate. It was, Nora noticed, missing several things. She waited until it finished. Then she asked, "How many relay stations are there on Earth?" Duras stopped, just briefly. The pause was not long enough to be dramatic. It was just long enough to be noticeable. Greth, standing to the side, answered. 14 confirmed. Possibly more at depths we have not fully mapped. Why didn't you remove them? Removal requires activation. Activation requires the script. We contain the script. We consider the risk of accidental activation to be negligible. Nora put the cup down. How long ago did you decide it was negligible? The containment protocol was established 212 years ago, so before humans had linguistics as a formal field of study. A silence. Aide Soren made a very small movement near the wall. Nora did not look at it, but she noted it. Greth said, carefully, the probability calculation did not account for certain human behaviors. Like a person spending 30 years lovingly copying ancient carvings into notebooks and then giving those notebooks to his granddaughter. Greth said nothing, which was an answer. Nora thought about her grandfather then. She thought about him the way she often did, not as an absence, but as a presence with a very specific texture. He had the kind of patience that most people confuse for stubbornness. He had followed these shapes from an island in the Pacific to mountain sites in 3 other countries, and then back to a university archive in the city where he was born. He had never once stopped. He had never once found anyone who knew what the shapes meant. She wondered now if part of him had always known he was looking at something that did not come from Earth. She wondered if that would have stopped him or only made him more determined. She thought she knew the answer. Duras said, "The relay station beneath the university is currently active and transmitting. We are working to determine the full scope of the signal. You will need to remain here while—" A tone from the flat device interrupted it. Not a gentle tone, a specific one, the kind used for specific people. Duras looked at the device. Something crossed its face. Greth straightened in a way that was almost imperceptible. "Director Hale," Duras said, and there was a new quality in its voice. Not fear exactly. The professional cousin of fear. The kind of person has when they answer to someone, and that someone has just called. The column of light from the device shifted. A new presence filled it in outline, distant but clear, with the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to across large distances. "Commander." The voice was even and cold in the way that still water in winter is cold. "I have reviewed the initial transmission report. I need you to understand the priority of what I am about to say." Duras said, "Understood. That signal cannot reach the outer sectors. I do not care what it takes. Handle it." The light went out. The room was quiet again. Nora looked at Duras, then at Greth, then at Aide Soren, who was looking at the floor with an expression that said it understood exactly what was happening and wished it did not. "The outer sectors," Nora said. "Why specifically the outer sectors?" Nobody answered her, which meant they all knew, and that was its own kind of answer. The analysis deck was not designed for comfort. It was designed for looking at things and understanding them quickly, which meant it was full of flat surfaces and light panels and beings who moved between them with the energy of people who had recently stopped sleeping. Nora counted 7 different species in the room and stopped counting because Greth was already pulling her toward a central display and explaining things faster than it had explained anything before. The signal from the relay station had been running for 1 hour and 40 minutes. In that time, the analysis team had broken it into identifiable components. Duras stood at the edge of the display, arms crossed, jaw set in the configuration of someone who has received bad news and is deciding how to present it as neutral news. Greth pulled up the breakdown. The signal was not a weapon trigger. Nora had not started a countdown to something catastrophic. She noted the small but genuine relief on several faces in the room when that part had been confirmed, which told her that until about 40 minutes ago, catastrophic had been a genuine possibility they were working around. IT was not a distress call either. It was not a beacon pulling something toward Earth. IT was an archive. Greth explained it in sections, checking her comprehension in the way of someone who genuinely wanted to be understood rather than someone performing explanation. The Kiru, knowing their extinction was coming and knowing they could not stop it, had used their relay network to build the largest information deposit in recorded galactic history. Everything, their biology, their language, their full social and political record going back to before they had interstellar travel, their accounts of every species they had ever made contact with, their version of events in every major galactic development they had been part of or had witnessed. They had designed the archive to transmit itself automatically to the nearest intelligent species capable of receiving it. The moment any one relay station was activated by a complete activation sequence. The complete activation sequence required a final glyph, a single closing stroke, the kind of thing someone who had copied everything else would eventually naturally supply. Nora sat with that for a moment. Her grandfather had copied everything except the last stroke. She had always thought the spiral looked unfinished. She had never questioned it. She had drawn it complete because incomplete shapes bothered her, had always bothered her since she was a child drawing in the margins of her homework. The closing stroke was obvious once you had all the other pieces. It was where the logic of the shape led. The Kiru had known that too. They had not made the final stroke difficult. They had made it inevitable for anyone patient and careful enough to copy the rest. They planned for someone like my grandfather, she said. They planned for a species that studies things it does not understand, Greth said. Your grandfather was a precise example of that. And the archive is broadcasting now. Yes, to every relay station in range that can receive the signal, which is most of them. Duras spoke from the edge of the display. The problem, it said, and the word had the weight of a door closing, is the content of the archive. It brought up a section. Nora could not read it directly, but the translation layer the analysis team had been building showed enough. Political records, agreements, accounts of events in the centuries before the Kiru's extinction, accounts that name names, species names, governing body names, the kind of records that do not stay private once they are known to exist. There are currently 5 galactic powers with seats on high command, Greth said quietly, whose official historical record is in direct conflict with what the Kiru archive states. Conflict, Nora said. The Kiru were not simply extinct. Their extinction had assistance. The room was not quiet. There were too many people working in it for it to be quiet. But the corner of it that held Nora and Greth and Duras had a quality of quiet around it that was distinct from the noise everywhere else. So this is not about the signal being dangerous, Nora said. This is about the signal being inconvenient. Duras said nothing. Nora looked at it steadily. Director Hale wants it suppressed because the archive tells a version of history that the people currently in power would prefer did not exist. Duras said, the political situation is considerably more complex than Aide Soren. The young one near the wall startled slightly. Nora said, has the signal already been received anywhere? Soren looked at Duras, then back at Nora. Then it made the decision that people who are young and have not yet learned to be careful sometimes make, which is the decision to simply tell the truth. 11 relay stations, it said, in 3 sectors. The archive is already transmitted. It cannot be recalled. The silence after that was the fullest silence the room had produced all day. Duras turned its head towards Soren with an expression that was absolutely professional and therefore absolutely unreadable, which was in some ways worse than if it had shown an actual reaction. Nora said, so when Director Hale said to handle it. She had not yet received the full transmission report, Greth said carefully. But she has it now. Yes. Nora thought about 40,000 years. She thought about a species that had known it was going to die and had spent what remained of its time not fighting the dying, but building something that would outlast it. Something small and buried and patient and very well designed for the specific habits of curious living things. She thought about her grandfather copying shapes on an island in the Pacific because they were beautiful and he wanted to understand them. She thought that whoever the Kiru were, they would have liked him. What happens now, she said, Greth said. High Command convenes a hearing. About me. About all of it. You're the activating party. That carries a formal status in the protocol. It paused. It means you have a right to speak at the hearing. Duras looked as though it had several feelings about this that it was professionally obligated not to express. Nora said, good. She picked up the not-quite tea from where she had carried it across the station without realizing it, and she drank the rest of it cold, because some things you finish even when the conditions are not ideal. Tell me how the hearing works, she said, and Greth began to explain. The hearing room was not a room. It was a table and a set of chairs in a space that connected to other spaces through light, other beings appearing as columns of projected presence at the far end, clear enough to read, but distant enough to remind everyone that High Command existed in a different location, a different weight class, a different category of concern than a university lecture hall in November. Director Hale occupied the central column. She was old in a way that had become structural rather than visible, the kind of old that had reorganized itself into authority so completely that the original person underneath was mostly theoretical. She had 4 arms, and she held each one still in a way that looked practiced. Nora sat at the table. Greth sat to her left. Duras sat to her right in the way of someone who has brought a guest to a party and is beginning to regret it. Professor Aldrich sat in the back of the room. Nobody had planned for this. He had been brought up from Earth as a formal witness to the activation event, required by a clause in the civilian contact protocol that Greth had found and cited before Duras could suggest an alternative. He had been sitting in the back for 20 minutes with a notepad, which he had asked for, and a pen, which Soren had provided, and he had been writing in it with the careful attention of a man who understood that he was part of something that would be written about later and wanted his notes to be accurate. Hale opened the hearing. She was efficient. The charges were real, and she presented them without drama, which made them sound worse. Unauthorized activation of a dormant heritage site. Transmission of a Category 1 restricted archive without clearance. Breach of the Sensitive Signal Containment Directive. The standard civilian ignorance clause applied, she noted, but the scale of the activation event meant that ignorance alone was insufficient mitigation. The activating party must submit to information management procedures to prevent further dissemination. This was standard. This was protocol. This would happen. She said all of it in the way of someone announcing the weather. Nora listened to all of it. Then she said, "I have some questions." Hale said, "This is not a question forum. You will have the opportunity to who wrote the Dormant Heritage Protocol." A pause. Small. Controlled. The protocol was established by the High Command Cultural Containment Division when, 212 years ago, was the Kiru Archive already known to exist at that time. Hale's forearm shifted. Slightly. The existence of a possible archive system was a matter of theoretical. Was it known or not? Greth, beside her, did not move. But something about the way it did not move suggested it was paying close attention. It was known, Hale said. So the protocol that makes what I did a violation was written specifically to prevent the Kiru archive from being found. It was written to prevent uncontrolled activation events by containing the only language that could cause one, which was the Kiru's own written language. Nora kept her voice level. She was not angry. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. She was precise. The protocol was designed to make sure that the Kiru's archive, which the Kiru built and designed and died making, would never be found. Who benefits from that? Hale said, the stability of the galactic, which species specifically benefit from the Kiru's version of events not existing. A full silence. Long enough to have a temperature. I'm a 19-year-old student, Nora said. I was in a class about the history of written symbols, and I was drawing shapes I learned from my grandfather because I was bored. I did not know what I was drawing. My grandfather did not know what he was copying. He found those shapes on a rock on an island that nobody owned, and he spent 30 years of his life studying them because they were interesting and beautiful, and he was the kind of person who thought that things worth studying should be studied. She put her hands flat on the table. The Kiru were a species that knew they were going to die. They spent whatever time they had left building a system to make sure they would not be forgotten. They designed it for exactly the kind of being my grandfather was. Patient, careful, curious, not affiliated with any government, not working from any agenda, just a person who found something and thought it deserved to be understood. She looked directly at Hale's projected column. You want me to sign a form agreeing to forget that my grandfather's life work just told the galaxy the truth about what happened to the Kiru, and you're calling it standard protocol, and you're presenting it as if the alternative is chaos. But the archive is already in 11 relay stations. It has already been received. The information already exists. What you are actually asking me to do is agree, formally, on the record, that the Kiru's version of their own history should be suppressed in favor of the version preferred by the people who benefit from their absence. She waited. I won't sign that. Hale looked at her for a long moment. You have no concept of the political consequence. Then explain it to me, Nora said. I'm a student. I'm very good at learning things. From the back of the room, Professor Aldrich looked up from his notepad. He cleared his throat in the specific way of a person who has decided that they are, in fact, going to say something. In human academic tradition, he said, into the silence, we refer to what she just did as making a rather good point. Duras, against what was clearly its better judgment, said, I am registering my vote against the suppression order. It was the first time in 11 years it had voted against Hale in a formal session. Everyone in the room knew this. The number did not need to be said for the weight of it to be present. Hale looked at Duras, then back at Nora. You have no idea, she said, quietly and with absolute certainty, what record-keeping costs. The light of her column went out. The hearing did not produce a suppression order. The archive remained in transmission. Nora sat at the table after the room cleared and did not say anything for a while, and Greth sat beside her and also did not say anything. And the quiet between them was the kind that exists after something has been decided, and the deciding was harder than it looked. The station had a window that looked toward Earth. Nora found it by accident, following a wrong turn after the hearing, while Greth was speaking to Duras, and Soren was trying to find out if the station had anything that could be made into a proper meal for a human. The corridor dead-ended at a wide panel of transparent material, and there was the planet, blue and white and very calm-looking from this distance. The way things always look calmer from far away. She stood there for a while. Greth found her. It stood beside her and looked at Earth the way someone looks at something they have been monitoring professionally for a long time and are now looking at in a different way for the first time. Nora said, did the Kira know it would be a random person? Greth said they believed any species advanced enough to study language would eventually produce someone curious enough to copy what they did not understand. They built a system for exactly that kind of person, not a scientist with funding and credentials. No, someone who found the shapes beautiful and wanted to preserve them. Nora thought about her grandfather writing in his notebooks at a folding table on an island with no reliable electricity, copying things by the light of a lamp because the carvings were only clearly visible in the late afternoon and he could not photograph and draw at the same time. She thought about the way he held a pen, the left-handed grip that smudged the ink slightly on every downstroke. The reason all his notebooks had a faint gray shadow under every line he wrote. She had the same grip. She had never thought about where she got it until now. Greth said, before you go. She looked at it. The Galactic Heritage Committee will be convening to assess the archive's contents officially. The process will take years. There are parties who will challenge the archive's authenticity, parties who will attempt to contextualize it in ways that reduce its impact, and parties who will simply proceed as if it does not exist and wait for attention to move elsewhere. This is how large political bodies respond to inconvenient truths, slowly and with enormous amounts of procedure. But it exists, Nora said. It exists, Greth agreed, and it is in 11 relay stations. The authentication is not in question among the people who understand the technology. The Kiru encoded their archive with verification structures that cannot be forged. What was sent is what was stored. What was stored is what happened. Nora nodded. Behind her, Soren appeared at the end of the corridor. It had something in its hand, a small flat chip, the kind of object that was clearly not standard issue anything. It walked up to Nora with the energy of someone who has rehearsed the next few seconds. This is an index of the archive, it said. It is not the full archive. It is a navigational document. It shows what is in the archive and where to find the relevant sections when the official translation becomes available. It paused. It is for research purposes. Greth said nothing. Soren said, with slightly more rehearsed confidence, it is entirely for research purposes. Greth continued to say nothing, which in Nora's experience of it over the past several hours meant something between approval and deliberate ignorance. And she took the chip. She was returned to Earth in the early evening. The ship settled in the car park again with the same precise care as before. The lights in the university building were back on. A facilities worker was taping a sign to the front entrance that said gas leak resolved, building reopened. There were no bicycles along the fence. They had been replaced, all 40 of them, with ones that were slightly nicer than the originals. Professor Aldrich was waiting on the steps. He had his coat on and his notepad under his arm and the expression of a man who had decided not to go home yet without fully knowing why. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you be in class on Thursday?" Nora said, "Yes." He said, "I won't mark today as an absence." She said, "I appreciate that." He looked at the ship for a moment, where Greth stood at the base of the ramp. Then he looked back at Nora. He seemed to want to say something else and could not locate the right shape for it. He settled for nodding once and walking away toward the car park exit with the precise posture of a man who is keeping himself together by means of very good academic habits. Nora went home. Her grandfather's notebooks were on the shelf where they always were. She had kept them in order the way he had kept them, each one in its paper sleeve. She took the first one down and opened it to the first page and read the shapes there with new eyes, because the archive index on the chip in her pocket contained a partial translation key, and she had been reading in the ship on the way back. The first entry in the first notebook was a phrase her grandfather had found on the outer edge of the main carving site. He had marked it with an asterisk and the word repeated, meaning it appeared more than once on different parts of the stone. She could read it now that IT said, "To whoever reads this, thank you for looking." She sat with that for a long time. Then she closed her grandfather's notebook and put it carefully back in its sleeve. She took a fresh notebook from the desk drawer, the kind with the plain cover, and she put it in front of her and opened it to the first page. She picked up her pen with a left-handed grip that smudged the ink on every downstroke, and she began to write. Somewhere in the sector wire reports that evening, filed between a trade dispute resolution and a routine territorial survey update, a small item appeared that most readers would skip without finishing. Kiru archive transmission confirmed. Authentic. Origin planet. Earth. Activating party. One human student, age 19. Galactic Heritage Committee convening emergency session. The reporter who wrote it added one final line, which was unusual for wire reports, but which the editor decided to leave in because it was accurate. This reporter notes that, statistically speaking, humans continue to be the most improbable species in documented contact history. They're also, this reporter suspects, exactly what the Kiru were hoping for.